The love of nature the Japanese people originally had was no doubt their innate aesthetic sense for things beautiful. But the appreciation of the beautiful is at bottom religious, for without being religious one cannot detect and enjoy what is genuinely beautiful. And there is no denying that Zen gave an immense impetus to the native feeling for nature, not only by sharpening it to the highest degree of sensitiveness, but also by giving it a metaphysical and religious background. In the beginning, probably, the Japanese were naively attracted to the beautiful which they saw about them. It is possible that they regarded all things in nature as uniformly animated with life, after the manner of primitive people who look upon even non-sentient things from their animistic point of view. But as they cultivated themselves in the Zen teaching, their aesthetic and religious sensitiveness was further nourished, and this nourishment came in the form of an exalted moral discipline and a highly spiritual intuition. That is to say, the snow-crowned peak of Fuji is now seen as rising from the background of emptiness. The pine trees ornamenting the monastery grounds are ever fresh and green because they are rootless and shadowless. The raindrops pattering on the roof of my humble hut transmit the echo of the ancient days when Kyosho and Sekcho and Saigyo and Dogen made their comments on the sound. The moonlight that leaked into the empty room of Hanshan and of the old couple in the Ugetsu house will also this evening visit your hotel with all its modern conveniences. You may say the universe remains ever the same, with Zen or without Zen. But my solemn proclamation is that a new universe is created every moment Zen looks out from its straw-thatched, 4.5-mat retreat. This may sound too mystical, but without a full appreciation of it, not a page of the history of Japanese poetry, Japanese arts, and Japanese handicrafts would have been written. Not only the history of the arts, but the history of the Japanese moral and spiritual life would lose its deeper significance if detached from the Zen way of interpreting life and the world. Otherwise, it would have been perhaps impossible for the Japanese people to stand against the unprecedented onslaught of modern science, machines, and commercial industrialism. Let me illustrate the spirit of Zen as lived by Ryokan, a Buddhist monk, who passed his unpretentious life in the province of Echigo early in the 19th century. His having been a monk does not weaken, as one may suppose, the strength of my statement that Zen has deeply entered into the life of the Japanese people for all those who came to associate with him, that is, the entire community in which he moved, approved of his life and saw in it something of permanent worth. To judge the direction of the wind, it is enough to look at a single blade of grass. When we know one Ryokan, we know hundreds of thousands of Ryokans in Japanese hearts. Ryokan was a Zen monk belonging to the Soto school, founded by Dogen in the Kamakura era, 1185 to 1338. His hut was built in the northern part of the country facing the Sea of Japan. From the ordinary worldly point of view, he was a big fool and a lunatic. He lacked what is known as common sense, of which we people of the world have too much. But he was very much liked and respected by his neighbors, and quarrels and other annoying incidents which sometimes darken our daily life cleared off if he happened to appear in the midst of them. He was an accomplished poet in Chinese and Japanese, and also a great calligrapher. Villagers and townspeople pursued him for his autograph, which he found very hard to refuse, for they devised many contrivances to get from him what they wanted. I said he was a lunatic and a great fool, this latter being his own literary name. But he had a most sensitive heart for all things human and natural. Indeed, he was love incarnate, a manifestation of Kwannon Bosatsu, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. His solitary retreat on a mountain away from the village was once or twice broken into by a burglar. The burglar must have been a complete stranger to the neighborhood, otherwise he would never have singled out this poor man's shelter to plunder. Naturally, there was nothing to carry away. He was greatly disappointed. Seeing this, Ryokan's heart was touched, and he gave him the clothes he had on. The burglar hastily left him with the outside amado open, from which a bright moon poured its light into Ryokan's room. The poet in him asserted itself. A burglar failing to carry off the moon, it shines in from the window. Another poem by him reads, "Where, I wonder, is he passing the night, this cold, freezing night, when it is even beginning to storm, a lonely wayfarer in a world of darkness?" This is also said to have been composed by the recluse and lover of humanity after another unwelcome visit by a stranger. The visited one himself must also have suffered the freezing night in the lonely hut. Sure enough, he came the following morning to his parental home with a flowing nose and shivering with cold to ask for bedding. He was also good to beggars. On his way home from his own begging tour, he was ready to give up everything he had to any unfortunate fellow being he might happen to meet. The following must have been composed on one of those occasions. If my robe dyed black were wide and broad enough, I would cover all the poor people of the world under my sleeves. He had very few desires as far as he was concerned. When one of the feudal lords in the neighboring districts once visited his hut in order to take him along to his own town and perhaps build a temple for his shelter and religious practices, this beggar poet remained silent for a while. When politely pressed for an answer, he wrote this: "As much fuel as I need is supplied by the wind. These fallen leaves I gather." So blessed in poverty, the Zen poet was a great troubadour of poverty. His poems, especially in Chinese, are full of these sentiments. He must have been an ardent admirer of Han Shan of the Tang dynasty, for his poems remind us at once of the highly spiritual atmosphere in which Han Shan moved. Here is one who is singing of poverty. In tatters, again in tatters, this is my life. For food I pick herbs by the roadside. In the moonlight I sit meditating all night long. Looking at the flowers, I forget to return home. This primitive life I have come to adopt ever since my association with the Buddhist Brotherhood. What lessons did he learn of the Buddhist Brotherhood? Some of them are in this poem. The past is already past. The future is not yet here. The present never abides. Things are constantly changing, with nothing on which to depend. So many names and words confusingly self-created. What is the use of wasting your life thus idly all day? Do not retain your time-worn views, nor pursue your newly fashioned imaginations. Sincerely and wholeheartedly make inquiries and also reflect within yourself, inquiring and reflecting and inquiring, until the moment comes when no further inquiries are possible. For this is the time when you will realize that all your past has been in the wrong. This shows how assiduously Ryokan had employed himself in the study of Buddhism before he came to lead his primitive life in an eternal stream of karma. Whence is my life? Whither does it depart? I sit alone in my hut and meditate quietly yet earnestly, with all my thinking, I know not whence, nor do I come to any whither. So it is with my present, eternally changing, all in emptiness. In this emptiness is the ego for a while, with its yeas and nays. I know not just where to set them up. I follow my karma as it moves with perfect contentment. What is the practical outcome of this philosophy of not knowing anything and of leaving karma, whatever this may be, to its own working? In short, what is Ryokan's life of absolute passivity or dependence or emptiness? His grass hut was a most unpretentious one, indeed, just large enough for himself, hence Gogô, which means half a sho, or less than 1 quart of rice, an amount considered enough for one full-grown man for a day's support. This solitary hut named Gogô-an, resembles a hanging bell in shape. It stands surrounded by the cedars growing thick, while a few poems decorate the inside walls. The cooking pot is sometimes found covered with dust, and smoke often fails to issue from the hearth. The lonely visitor is an old man of the eastern village, who occasionally knocks at the door when the moon is bright. One autumnal eve I was wakeful, took a staff, and went out of doors. The crickets were singing under the ancient tiles. The dead leaves were fast falling off the shivering trees. Far away the stream was heard murmuring. The moon was slow to rise above the high peak. All conspired to draw me on to a deep meditation, and it was some time before I found my robe heavily wet with dew. This apostle of poverty and solitude, or would it be better to call him a grand nature mystic, had a very warm heart for nature and all objects of nature, plants and animals. As he makes allusions in his poems to a bamboo grove surrounding his hut, many bamboo shoots must have been growing there. He liked them very much, I suppose, for food, but chiefly for their growing straight, for their being freshly green all year round. Their roots are firmly set in the ground, while the trunk is hollow, symbolizing emptiness. Ryokan liked this character in the bamboo. Once, it is said, a young growing shoot began to break through the floor of his closet. He took interest in it. At last, seeing it grow too tall for the enclosure, he started to remove the roof for it. He tried to burn the roof with a candle. Did he think it the easiest way to accomplish the work? Perhaps he had no such design in his mind. He simply wanted to give room to the young plant, and seeing the candle most available at the time, he began the work. But unfortunately the roof caught fire more extensively than was first intended, and the whole structure, together with the bamboo itself, I believe, was burned down. The height of stupidity, indeed, this burning of a roof for the sake of a bamboo shoot. I mean, from our practical point of view. But I feel like condoning, or rather admiring his stupidity. There is something so genuine, or shall I say, so divine in his feeling for the bamboo shoot. There is something like this in every genuine act of love. We, as human beings, so given up to all kinds of practical and sordid considerations, are unable to follow every pure impulse of kindly feeling. How often do we deliberately suppress or repress the impulse? In us the impulse may not always be so thoroughly undefiled as in our poet lunatic, and this may be our conscious reason for repression or suppression. If so, our life ought to be purged of all impurities before we criticize Ryokan. Ryokan's love for pine trees appears in his poems. He does not seem to have been much of a talker or writer. Everything that went through his sensitive mind was caught up in his poems, which took various forms according to his mood at the time, either in Chinese or in classical Japanese of 31 syllables, or in the shorter form of 17 syllables, or in the style of folk song, or in the manyo style of many syllables. He was quite an expert in all of these compositions, but not conventionally bound by literary rules, which he frequently ignored. The other favorite form in which he gave expression to his inner life was calligraphy. In our case, his literary products will better lead us into his inward sentiments. He sings of a solitary old pine tree at Kugami. At Kugami, in front of the Otono, there stands a solitary pine tree, surely of many generations. How divinely dignified it stands there. In the morning, I pass by it. In the evening, I stand underneath it. And standing, I gaze, never tired of this solitary pine. There must have been something intensely fascinating about this ancient tree. In fact, every old tree of any sort inspires a beholder with a mystic feeling, which leads him to a faraway world of timeless eternity. There was another pine tree at Iwamuro which deeply stirred his feelings of pity. The tree must have been a young one, with no stately outstretching branches. It was raining hard, and Ryokan saw it all drenched. At Iwamuro, in the middle of the field, a solitary pine stands. How I pity this solitary pine standing all alone, thoroughly drenched in showers. If it were a human being, I would give him a raincoat. I would help him with a rain hat. Pitiful, indeed, this solitary tree. Japan is the country of pine trees and cedars. The latter are seen to their best advantage in a group or in a row, and the former are fine when they stand singly. The Japanese species of the pine known as matsu generally spreads its branches irregularly, and the trunk is gnarled. A solitary old pine tree growing for ever so many years in front of your room is such a consoling friend for the scholar or monk. Ryokan's attitude toward the tree in the field drenched in rain was naturally that of pity. But with Saigyo, the tree stood in a different environment, and the man was of a different type of character, at least in a different mood of spirit at the time, hence the following poems of Saigyo. For a long time to come, stand here as thriving as ever, and remember our companion days, even after my death, O pine, for I am the one who lives in the world, unknown, unloved. Tired of staying here, if I start my wandering again, O pine, would you not be solitary? Ryokan, the lover of trees, was also a great friend of the louse, perhaps also of the flea, of the mosquito, and so on. He had a tender human feeling for all beings. One interesting, though not quite engaging incident recorded of him is his care for the louse. The story is illustrative of his general attitude toward other forms of life. He was often seen during the early warm winter days giving the lice a sunbath and exercise in the air. By taking them out one by one from his underwear onto sheets of paper, he exposed them to the sun. Before it begins to be too cool in the afternoon, they will be picked up and taken back into his own chest, or fudokoro. As he says, "Oh, lice, lice, if you were the insects singing in the autumn fields, my chest would really be, for you, the Musashino prairie." The subject may not be very edifying, I'm afraid, but his genuine, unadulterated love for such creatures has in it something tender and touching. Our modern idea of hygienic cleanliness has much to say about harboring beings of this class, but it was not so very long ago, I am told, that in England gentlemen and ladies of the higher classes were not exempt from vermin, that the wearing of wigs over their heads was indeed partly due to their annoying presence, and that even these wigs were often full of nits. Dr. Hans Zinser, writing in a 1935 issue of Atlantic Monthly on the history of the louse, noted that, even long into the 18th century, lice were regarded as necessities. Further, he notes that George Washington, in his 14th year, copied a paragraph on rules of civility, which contains the following remarkable statements. Kill no vermin, as fleas, lice, ticks, etc., in the sight of others. If you see any filth or thick spittle, put your foot dexterously upon it. If it be upon the clothes of your companions, put it off privately, and if it be upon your own clothes, return thanks to him who puts it off. Ryokan was a great lover of children, as might be expected of such a character as he, who was himself a child. He liked to play with them. He played hide-and-seek. He played temari, a form of handball too. One evening it was his turn to hide, and he hid himself well under a straw stack in the field. It was growing darker, and the children, not being able to locate him, left the field. Early in the following morning, a farmer came and had to remove the straw stack to begin his work. Finding Ryokan there, he exclaimed, "Oh, Ryokan-sama, what are you doing here?" The poet lunatic answered, "Hush, don't talk so loud, the children will find me." Did he wait for the children all night under the straw? Did it never occur to him that the young ones were just as deceiving and untrustworthy as the grown-ups? But to reason like this is our human way in this world of unrealities. He perhaps followed another order of reasoning, that of burning the roof to save the bamboo shoot. It was his simplicity that made him spend the whole night in the open field, with the controlling idea of hiding from his young, guileless but occasionally mischievous friends. The story being somewhat extreme, its genuineness may be suspected, but the fact that it has been in circulation conclusively proves his readiness at any moment to follow this pattern of action. These days, we live under such varied rules of convention. We are really slaves to ideas and notions, fashions and traditions, which constitute the psychological background, or what is now popularly called the ideology, of modern people in the organization. We can never act as Whitman advises. We are in a state of complete slavery, although we may not realize it, or rather, are not willing to admit it. When we see Ryokan giving himself up to the free movement of his feelings, which are thoroughly purged, to follow the conventional parlance of all egotistically oriented defilements, we feel as refreshed as if we were transported into another world. In his love of children we recognize the same psychological trait of independence and spontaneity that was exhibited in his feeling for a solitary pine tree and a bamboo shoot breaking through the floor. His love of playing tamari and otedama with children is also indicative of his free, playful spirit, which we all have, but are constrained from indulging in, imagining that such playing is below the dignity of grown-ups. While playing tamari and otedama, winnings are reckoned by singing a popular ditty. The bouncing of the tamari, the turning of hands, and the rhythmic chant of voices, however simple, they perhaps help to give expression to Ryokan's simple and undeceiving spirit. This is of a piece with his liking to dance a primitive village dance on festival occasions. He was once found dancing with the villagers, disguised as a young woman. One of the dancers nearby, recognizing Ryokan, made a remark about his, or rather her, being a good dancer, purposely audible enough for Ryokan to overhear it. It is said that Ryokan later mentioned it to his friends with a feeling of elation. There is in every one of us a desire to return to a simpler form of living, which includes simpler ways of expressing feelings and also of acquiring knowledge. The so-called way of the gods points to it, although I do not know exactly what signification the advocates of Kaminagara no Michi want to give to this term. It seems to be certain to my mind that by this they wish to mean going back to, or retaining, or reviving the way in which the gods are supposed to have lived before the arrival of humankind. This way was one of freedom, naturalness, and spontaneity. How did we ever go astray from this? Here lies a great fundamental religious problem. Its solution gives the key to understanding some aspects of Zen Buddhism and of the Japanese love of nature. When we speak of being natural, we mean first of all being free and spontaneous in the expression of our feelings, being immediate and not premeditating in our response to environment, not making any calculation as to the effect of our doings either on others or on ourselves, and conducting ourselves in such a way as not to leave room for thought of gain, value, merit, or consequence. To be natural means, therefore, to be like a child, though not necessarily with a child's intellectual simplicity or its emotional crudity. In a sense, the child is a bundle of egotistic impulses, but in its assertion of these it is altogether natural. It has no scrupulousness, no deliberation as regards practical and worldly merit or demerit. In this respect, the child is angelic, even divine. It ignores all the social devices that keep grown-ups decent and conventional and law-abiding. It is living under no such artificial human-made constraints. The practical outcome of such behavior may not always be acceptable to the taste of so-called cultivated, refined, sophisticated people of the world. But the question here is not one of such practical considerations, but of the genuineness of motive, the disinterestedness of feeling, and the immediateness of response. When there is thus no crookedness in one's heart, we may say that one is natural and childlike. In this there is something highly religious, and angels are represented sometimes as babies with wings. And this is the reason why the Zen artists have a special liking for painting Hanshan and Jitoku or Hote with a group of children. Going back to nature, therefore, does not mean going back to the natural life of primitive and prehistoric peoples. It means a life of freedom and emancipation. The one thing that hampers and complicates our modern life especially is the concept of teleology, which we are all made to feel in every phase of our life. The concept is all right as far as our moral, economic, intellectual, and terrestrial existence is concerned, but this existence of ours means far more than all these considerations, for we never feel completely satisfied with them. We seek for something going really far deeper than the merely moral and intellectual. As long as we are on the plane of the teleological conception of existence, we are in no way free, and not being free is the cause of all the worries, all the miseries, all the conflicts that are going on in this world. To be thus free from all conditioning rules or concepts is the essence of the religious life. When we are conscious of any purpose whatever in our movements, we are not free. To be free means purposelessness, which of course does not mean licentiousness. The idea of a purpose is something the human intellect reads into certain forms of movement. When teleology enters into our life, we cease to be religious, we become moral beings. So with art. When purpose is too much in evidence in a so-called work of art, art is no longer there, it becomes a machine, or a so-called advertisement. Beauty runs away, ugly human hands become altogether too visible. Suchness in art consists in its artlessness, that is, purposelessness. In this, art approaches religion, and nature is a perfect specimen of art, inasmuch as there is no visible purpose in the waves rolling on from the beginningless past in the Pacific Ocean, and in Mount Fuji covered with ancient snow, standing absolutely pure high against the sky. In the flower we, as beings obsessed with utilitarian ideas, may read its going to seed, and in seeds sense the harboring of a life for the coming years. But from the religious aesthetical angle of observation, flowers as flowers are red or yellow, and leaves as leaves are green. And in this all utilitarian and teleological or biological conceptions are excluded. We admire a machine most exquisitely and most delicately balanced and most efficiently working, but we have no feeling of going toward it. It is a thing altogether distinct from us, which stands here ready to obey our commands. Not only that, we know every part of it mechanically, and the purpose for which it is set to work. There is no mystery, as it were, in the whole construction of it. There are no secrets. There is no autonomous creativeness here. Everything is thoroughly explainable, subject to laws discovered by physics or dynamics or chemistry or some other science. Yet an ink sketch composed of a few strokes of the artist's brush, apparently very crudely executed, awakens in us the deepest of feelings and engages the attention of our whole being. In the same way, when we face nature, our whole being goes into it and feels every pulsation of it as if it were our own. To speak of an identification is a desecration, for it is a mechanical and logical conception which does not apply to this phase of our life, and this is where Zen Buddhism has its realm. It is the corner from which people like Ryokan survey the world. I cannot help making reference in this connection to the Nirvana picture of the Buddha. This may not seem to be a fit subject to be introduced here. What has the Nirvana picture to do with the Japanese love of nature or with Zen Buddhism, one may argue? But what I wish to see in the picture, as it is generally painted in Japan, has some significant bearing on the Buddhist attitude toward nature. And as the picture has much to do with the Zen monasteries in Japan, and further, as the picture has an unusual fascination for the Japanese generally, I will point out here one or two facts regarding the Nirvana scene of the Buddha. I have not yet been able to trace the historical development of the Nirvana conception as we have it today. As tradition ascribes the first idea, or rather the first authorship of the picture, to Wu Taozi, the well-reputed painter of the Tang era, it is likely that it originated first in China. But I have at present no means of ascertaining how far and how strongly it has taken hold of the imagination of the Chinese people. It is certainly in Japan that it has entered deeply into the religious consciousness of the people. The picture has come to be intimately connected with the Buddhist life of Japan, especially with Zen. There must be something in it which appeals powerfully to us all.